Wow, so nice to be back to the premier creation group in the nation. And I think maybe one of the longest running ones, and one of my favorite places to speak because it feels like family. Good. I want to start before I jump right into my talk, and let's see, I've got to switch it over to that. There's my picture of Fiji. So we were, and I'm sure you've heard about this before, but Julie Von Vet and myself were able to go in with one of the creation devotionals and a qualified team of scientific speakers and go into essentially every single high school in the entire nation over a 4-year period and connect the Bible to science, history, and reality. I mean, it's really, really a powerful way to do evangelism. The topic tonight, I kind of like it, is the 3 most significant events in all of human history. And even at supper, we were talking about them, and nobody got my whole list of what I picked as the top 3. So they all got like C+ at best, but we'll see how we do. Before I jump right into it, I left my job at Dow Chemical 16 years ago when I was 49, turned 65 this year. Been to 14 nations, given thousands of lectures to over 100,000 people over the years and students, way over that. But my goal is always, I think you said you kind of like me coming. I think it's because I have a kind of a simple mind. I really try to boil things down to useful, understandable, and relevant. And that's what this talk's all about too. And the resources, the books, are always just one-page topics, very visual, very interesting, intriguing stuff about what God has done in nature and in history. 2 new things I've done this year, and I don't think I had these last year. One of them, with the authors of our original creation devotional, we came up with a book we called Evidence Pursuit, or not a book, but a game. And it's a series of hundreds of questions about either creation with 1 pack of cards or general Bible knowledge centered around all the prophetic things God has done and said in the Bible in another set of cards. And I'm just going to test you guys as the premier creation group. Okay. And it deals with all sorts of topics, and the answers are found in the book and they're referred to on the card. But for instance, here's one on biology. Actually, it's on anthropology. Archaeology. I'll get it right. Okay, here it is. Archaeology. The oldest eye surgeries go back about 4,000 years. Doctors were so skilled that they were held accountable if they did not succeed. According to ancient manuscripts from the Code of Hammurabi, this was the penalty if an eye doctor failed. A, they had to return their fee. By the way, you all have to vote, but you only get to vote for 1, so listen carefully. A, they had to return their fee. B, they had their fingers cut off. C, they became a slave to the blind man. Or D, they lost their license to practice as a doctor. So how many think A, they have to return their fee? 1, okay. They had their fingers cut off. About 12. They became a slave to the blind man. So it's definitely going to be the majority, a good 20. They lost their license to practice. 1 or 2 or 3. Okay, so you're across the board. The point of this game is always, it's fun to do trivia, but then with family or friends or whatever you're driving places, there's always something on the back to intrigue your thinking and point you back to God's Word. And that's my goal with every talk I give. The correct answer, according to this document, they think goes back about 3,000 to 4,000 years. They had their fingers cut off if they failed. The point being, this skill probably came from knowledge from before the global flood. Archaeological discoveries continue to prove that people have always been highly intelligent, not slowly increased intelligent from apes to humans. So it's just all sorts of fun questions like that. The second thing, I spent 4 years from about 2016 to 2020 filming an 18-part curriculum, because I've been teaching creation for 30 years. And I've always sold them as DVD sets with 6 lectures, 6 talks, and they've been filmed all over the United States. Grand Canyon, Mount Rushmore, science museums, Huntsville Space Museums, art museums, just all over the place. And I hired a young man, worked for me full time for 3.5 of those 4 years. So it cost about $200,000 to produce these. They're really, really well done. They're called the Rocks Cry Out series. Problem being, nobody under 30 knows what in the world to even do with this thing called a DVD. So I've put all of them on a flash drive, DVD quality, plus a documentary of what happened in Fiji when we went to all of these high schools, plus like a 1-hour overview of what is the best evidence for creation from biology, geology, astronomy. So there's 21 different lectures, and it's $35 for all of them. And then you can watch them, any TV, flat screen, just plug it in and up pops the menu with the lectures. And so I appreciate it if you buy one, but then feel free if you watch something and you know someone who would benefit from it, just copy it, put a link to it, and send it to them. You have my permission to use it to impact people's thinking. So that's a really neat tool. Now, topic of tonight. We all have had things happen in our lives that are really, really significant. So if you had to make a list of what are the most significant things that have happened, not just to you personally, but to everything around you in your lifetime, like what kind of a list would you come up with? And people kind of don't have much trouble coming up with that, but it depends on your age. I mean, someone that's only been around for the last, 20 years, they're just not even in college yet. I have a feeling that the whole world almost shutting down because of COVID is going to be on that list. Really significant. It impacted this entire globe. Others, as you get a little older, I bet something like the Twin Towers being destroyed shows up on your list. And it really drove the direction of our country in a lot of ways after that. If you're older than that, I don't know, Watergate might be pretty big. It changed our very perspective of the honesty of politicians. Or how about Man on the Moon? How many remember that? Raise your hand. How many were up watching that on TV when it happened? Oh, not near as many hands. Got the old white-haired folks. How about my parents? What would be on their list? World War II would definitely be on that list. Before that, the Great Depression would definitely be on that list. Whatever you come up with, I will guarantee you 1,000 years from now, it will be irrelevant. Nobody, unless you're a historian that loves little nuggets from ancient history, is going to care one whit about what you think has been the most significant thing that ever happened. It's reality. I mean, who knows what happened in the year 1000 AD? I can't list one unless I look at a book and look it up and there's some war or some king or something. It's not relevant to today. But there have been 3 things on my list that have happened, actual, factual events that totally changed all of humanity for all of the future that was ever going to follow these events. Unbelievably significant events. Now, the first 2 on my list are totally denied by the world around us as if they never even happened. Across the board, in the intellectual, the museum, the media, the internet system, they're universally denied and ridiculed if they're ever even brought up. The last one, even most churches give it lip service, but then they treat it as if it's not even that relevant in its real implications. Now, all 3 of these involve God, and you probably know where I'm heading with this, but I'm hoping I'll present it in a way that maybe you'll get something out of it you can share with somebody in some conversation at some point. But they involve the very character of God, His love and His justice. Now, to comprehend why they're so significant, it's not just that they happened, these real events. in Earth history. You have to understand why they happened. And you have to understand the very nature of God. Now that's why this is a creation talk. In the book of Romans, this is basically one of my life verses, and you've heard it over and over again, I'm sure. But it's just a little part of it. It's Romans 1:20. It says, the invisible things of God may be known from the creation of the world because they're clearly seen. They're understood by what has been made, God's power and his nature. The very power and the nature, the characteristics of God can be understood by what he has made, by observing creation. So every human being is without excuse for belief in him because they just have to observe what he's made. And you're without excuse, not just for belief in him, but for knowing he exists and for knowing his nature, the nature of God. Now, part of what I'm going to deal with is the nature of time, and it's really important later on as we start to look at these great events. But before I go there, and even get to the very first major, most important, significant event of all human history, I want to talk about, especially the Old Testament, how they conveyed things, and it spreads right into the New Testament. In the Bible, and I've heard this from theologians, to emphasize things in Hebrew, they would repeat them. Okay, they'd say the same thing and then say the same thing again, either verbatim or very, very close. And that was their way of emphasizing it. When I was in college, way back in the dark ages, taking thermodynamics to become a chemical engineer, we had a teacher who would be up here writing all these equations and explaining things to us. And every once in a while, he'd stop and turn around and he'd point to something he just wrote and he'd say, "This is really important." Now, it took not very long for us to realize whenever he turned around and said, "This is really important," it was going to show up on the next test. And that's English. We have words we use to tell us something is important or something matters. Hebrew would repeat it. For instance, we all know there's times when Jesus would say, "Verily, verily, I say to you," or "Truly, truly, I say to you." You repeat it twice. Or he'd say to the Pharisees, "Woe to you," because it was really, really significant what they had done and why it mattered. Moses wrote at one point, it's the witness of two, or two accounts of something that determine the truth of a matter. So it's that repetition was the way of indicating significance. I only remember one place, and I could be wrong, in the Bible where it repeats something 3 times. That means it's really, really, really important to know. Some of you are nodding your head, I bet you already know where. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, the maker of heaven and earth. In Revelation, 3 times. That means it's really important. And by the way, holy, if you properly understand it, means righteous. It means by God's character, he can't ignore sin, or he wouldn't be holy. By his very nature, he can't ignore it. Now, there's one place in Scripture where something is said 4 times, one after another, after another, after another. And I'm just going to read that, and it's at the very beginning of the Bible. Now, I'm going somewhere with this. I'm laying groundwork, okay? Because this matters as we start to understand these significant events of human history. And this is Genesis, the very first chapter. God has done all of his creation acts, and he finally comes to the pinnacle of creation, the most important thing he's ever made. And it's the end of the first chapter, which is the overview of creation. And then chapter 2 seems to be a zeroing in on that most important part, which was mankind. And God said, "Let us make man in our image." That's one time he says that. "After our likeness." That's 2 times he says that. And then just jumping down half a sentence to the next verse, "So God created man in his own image." 3 times we're told that. "In the image of God, he created him." 4 times God tells us this. Male and female, he created them. lest we be confused about 6,000 years later about what is a male and what is a female. Who in the world could that, how could that ever happen? 4 times. We can't even begin to fathom how much God loves us. He poured the very essence of who he himself is into his final act of creation. Now that is really important as we start to look at the most significant things that ever happened in all of human history. Now, across the board at our table of the board of directors of the creation group, Twin Cities Creation Science Association, every one of them flunked because they didn't read the title closely enough of my talk. You see, they said creation would be the first most important, significant human event, or significant event in human history. But creation happened before humans were even around. So it couldn't be human history, because we were the last thing that happened before creation was over. So history is what happened in the past. So the very first most significant event in all human history would have had to have been after human beings existed, which would have been what's commonly in church language called the fall of man. The fall of man changed everything. And God just gives us the teeniest little tiny glimpses of the before and after. Before the fall, Adam walked daily in this garden paradise that God had created of the whole earth with the Creator. I don't know if he could physically see God, but I suspect there was something there that was just absolutely intimate that was destroyed in a moment. Creation is clearly described as perfect. It says even the plants ate of every substance provided, indicating plants. It's the clear language of the text. So there's every indication there is no death, no human or animal death. Now, what is that like? We don't know. But I do know if you ask any physician or any geneticist or any biologist, why does any organism die? Why do humans age and die? Every one of them will say it's because every copy of every cell that's made, there are mistakes, and that copy is a little worse than the one before it. It's why our skin sags and our hair turns white and our muscles wear out and we just totally deteriorate over today about a 100-year period. But every generation also has more permanent genetic mistakes to the DNA code that creates everything in our bodies as we go from a single cell and then split and split and split and eventually are born as a baby. That baby has more mistakes than the one generation before. And that's why lifetimes have dropped off from originally, even after the fall in the 800 and 900 year range, down to 80 or 90 years today. And by the way, the last page in my newest devotional, Without Excuse, Julie and my book, it talks about that. And you can Google this. Today, in America, great country with lots of medical care, only 1 person out of 20 will live to be 90 years old. We're dropping like flies in our 80s. And only 1 person out of 2,000 will live to be 100 years old. 999 of them will be dead, of typical people. All of us are going to die, and that's because of why. Well, I'll come back to that in a moment. So that was before the fall, absolute paradise. Now, what was it like? I suspect every time a cell divided, because there was no death, you would have a perfect copy. And if every time a cell divided you had a perfect copy, we would live physically forever. We would never physically die or age. That would have been the original creation. Now, there may have been other things. I don't know how time worked before then. Time may have been different. The laws of physics may have been different. Jesus, when he came back with what we call a glorified body, he could be one place and then be another place. Maybe that was the norm. We don't know. That's the point. It's all speculation. But the point is, it was very, very different. And it all came to a grinding halt. Because after the fall, human beings were sentenced to death. Why? Because God is holy, holy, holy. He knows where sin will lead. It will never be satisfied. It'll never be enough. He knows it will lead to slavery and greed and murder and bloodshed and hatred and slavery, just sexual, everything. It'll just deteriorate to where life has lost its value of the most important thing he's made, which are human beings. And he can't not act, or he wouldn't be holy. Now, God brought death into creation. The world around us doesn't get this. They're trained that the rock layers are filled with death for millions and millions of years. So it's always been around, so it has nothing to do with mankind's actions. So it must be the result of God just making things that way. See, they twist reality because they've left out a mighty act of God and a real significant event of human history. That's what we as Christians have got to get people to realize. These things are real. Then you can start to impact their thinking in other ways. But how could God be so mean? Think about it. If God had not brought death into creation, we would have continued to have lived forever. But God is holy, we're not. We would have lived forever and for all eternity be separated from him. Never, ever have close fellowship again with the one who made us. God loves us too much for that. But he's too just to not allow no penalty. So he brought death into creation. Work became a burden rather than a pleasure. We get that little clue in Genesis 3. There became pain in childbirth. There had to have been physical, biological changes that happened at the point of creation being cursed. Thorns appeared. That's a physical, biological change. See, the whole creation changed when we sinned. Why? So we wouldn't forever be separated from God. Now, I'll get to the time aspect in a moment, but just keep all that in mind. So that's the most significant event. The first thing that happened. The world treats us as if it never happened. God tells us, don't forget his mighty acts, because when we do, we twist his very nature. Now, the second one is the flood of Noah. And again, it's an act of both love and justice. You see, it came at a point where biblically there was only one righteous man left. Now, was he perfect? No, but he was still a man who sought after following God to the best of his ability as a fallen human being. It came in the same year that the man who lived the longest of any human being that's ever lived died. I think that's God does these things as a pattern and for symbolic meaning and for remembrance. And you can track that down biblically. You can add up when Methuselah was born, and you can track up the year he died, and you can track up the year the flood happened, and that's when he died. So that shows God's desire that none would perish, his long-suffering, his patience. And this is what I see. Those rocks are filled with death, okay? And there are trillions of them. This is a trilobite. It's a solid rock. It's an animal that used to live under the ocean. And they're all over the place. They're not even that expensive. You can buy them for 10 or 20 bucks, the smaller ones. We found so many of them. So when you're walking around on these rock layers all over the earth, whether it's in China, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in Pakistan, whether it's out west, whether it's in Australia, you look at the right rock layer and there's all this death. And you have to ask yourself, why is there all this death here? God locked into the very rocks upon which we cry the second most significant thing that ever happened in all of human history. And that is that our actions have what brought death upon this planet. If God had not brought the judgment of the flood at that moment, I get the sense, it's not scriptural, actually written as this, but I get the sense there would have been nobody left who had any interest at all in ever following God. We would have been lost as a human species. And it happens every generation. If you look at Israel, they would turn back to God, and then within a few generations, they're worshiping idols, and God would bring judgment. And they turn back to God, and then for a few generations, they're worshiping idols, and He'd bring judgment. So God could do that generation after generation, century after century, millennium after millennium, all the way from 4,000 years ago till today. Or He could bring a judgment upon the earth that every human being in every place in the earth could just look down and realize that flood is here because of our rebellion, death exists because of our actions. And it would be locked into the very rocks throughout time, never to be forgotten. And by the way, I think the year before last, a phenomenal book came out called Echoes of Ararat. And the author had spent 10 years studying flood accounts from everything North America, Central America, and South America. And there's 300 different cultures in just North, Central, and South America that mention or talk about this flood. Worldwide, there's probably 500 or 600 flood legends. So it's a pervasive knowledge across humanity. I like to say, if all these cultures, 500 cultures across the world, they all had a remembrance of some flying thing that came from outer space and landed upon the earth and brought technology for mankind to advance. And that same remembrance, or bits or pieces of it, showed up in 500 cultures across the world, there wouldn't be a textbook on the planet that didn't say this proves aliens exist and brought it here. But that's exactly what we have with the flood. And there's not a peep of it in any textbook. Because the flood means God judges sin. And there was a real event on Earth history. Now I'm going to spend about 15 minutes with the best teaching in my 30 years of teaching about creation. I'm going to belabor this point more than anything else that I've ever come across that has the most impact in people's thinking to show this flood was a real event. Because people, they need to see things and they need to have experienced things to know that they're real. And most ancient history is just speculation because nobody has a time machine. But an event happened in my lifetime, and I would put this on the list of the most significant biblical confirmation events that have ever happened, at least in my lifetime. And that's what happened at Mount St. Helens in 1980. And I'm going to just go through that real quickly because most of you might have heard this, but it's a great reminder, and some of you, I suspect, have never heard these things that happened only 33 years ago at Mount St. Helens. 43 years ago. Mount St. Helens was one of the volcanoes in the Pacific Northwest. There's Mount Hood and Mount Adams and Mount St. Helens and Mount Rainier. And there were volcanoes that were going off during Noah's flood. Yellowstone was a huge 20-mile across caldera, a big round area at the top of Yellowstone going off. Africa, a large part of it's volcanic material that flowed out underwater. A large part of the ocean basins are magma, which flowed out underwater to form ocean basins and so on, all during the flood. Well, Mount St. Helens became active in 1979 and erupted multiple times, but the top blew off in April of 1980. In the top third of it, like 8,000 degree steam and ash just pulverized the top of that mountain. There was an earthquake tremor that weakened a piece of the fault line, and a third of the top of the mountain slid down into the valley. And the researchers estimate that fluid, all sorts of rubble and boulders and ash and steam, fluidized, flowed about 200 miles an hour down into the valley. Now here's the mountain that was erupting full force, and it erupted for about 6 hours. And if you could gather up all that ash from that mountain, it would cover about 1 cubic kilometer. So let's just work in miles, about a mile in width, a mile in length, a mile in height. Doesn't sound like much, but that's a lot of material. 100 years earlier, a mountain erupted in Krakatoa, 1883 in the South Pacific. It essentially pulverized the island. The explosion could be heard 1,000 miles away. It shot ash 20 miles up into the atmosphere that took up to 3 years for some of it to settle back and fall back down to Earth. And it changed the weather pattern of the Earth to the point Europe, on the other side of the world, that summer, the volcano erupted in the late spring. That summer, their average temperatures were lower than they normally were in the winter. And it took 3 years for the average temperature on Earth to return to normal because of one volcano. Now, during Noah's flood, there were thousands of volcanoes going off. We're told the fountains of the Great Deep broke forth. Most of Australia, most of the Pacific Northwest, a lot of Africa, it's all lava that flowed out underwater. And you can tell by its characteristics that that's what happened. So there's just all sorts of volcanoes erupting, not for 6 hours, but day after day after day after day, week after week. Now that would have caused all sorts of cloud cover that would have driven an ice age following the flood, and all these pieces of the past start to fit together when you don't ignore the flood. Now I'm going to show you some of the things that happened at Mount St. Helens, but I want you to imagine an Olympic swimming pool. Okay, just in your mind. Think of an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Now imagine you take an eyedropper with a single drop of water and just go bloop, and drop that drop into that swimming pool. Mount St. Helens, compared to the worldwide flood, is like that drop of water compared to the whole swimming pool. This is what Mount St. Helens looked like before it erupted. This is the same view angle after the eruption. Total devastation. There was a blast wave that knocked down over 1 million trees. Ash covered everything. All the needles were ripped off of everything that was in the way of the blast pattern. The mountain that slid down into the valley was all of this mud that split. About half of it flowed into this lake called Spirit Lake. The other half flowed on down this debris flow in that direction, and then it kind of settled to a stop. But it was mixed with all this steam and hot air and gases, okay? Well, it packed that steam below the surface of the sediment, but steam being a very energetic, high temperature, high energy gas, it would kind of pocket itself into big reservoirs, and then hours and even days after the eruption, the steam would burst upward and the land would collapse downward. And that's what you're seeing here. This picture was taken a couple days after the flood. A helicopter flying by happened to capture a poof, and a whole bunch of ash floats up. And when the ash cleared, this is what it looked like. Now, all this gray stuff is the ash that settled on top of the mountain. This stuff is the sediment that flowed down the mountain, and it's about 600 foot deep in certain places. Well, when the steam burst upward, the land collapsed downward, and it formed all of these crevicey, craggy, erosional looking patterns. Now, geologists who leave the Bible out of their thinking, they're trained to never even consider the idea there could have been a worldwide flood. They're trained that when they see this erosional pattern anywhere out west, over in Europe, in Asia, in China, down in South America, they see all these rock layers that are just kind of craggy looking areas. It's because rain and freezing and thawing and hail and storms and wind have slowly carried away sediment, and over millions of years it forms that pattern. It's called the dendritic drainage pattern. Except that exact pattern didn't form over millions of years. It formed in a matter of seconds. See, all you need to form enormous geological changes is lots of energy in a short period of time. Or you need, if you don't have a lot of energy, if you deny the flood, then you have to have a long period of time with little bits of energy. But you get the same result. So it's all a matter of what are you going to choose to believe. Now, these pits were, again, steam explosion pits. These happen to be circular. There's a helicopter for scale. And as about 4 months later, there was another mud flow out of that volcanic area. And a bunch of steam broke loose. It broke loose some mud. It went screaming down through the valley, and it broke from pit to pit to pit to pit. And now you could look What do the layers look like of this stuff that flowed at 200 miles an hour down into the valley, and it's 600 foot thick? And they expected it to be all blended together. Well, instead, what they saw were perfectly smooth horizontal lines. Like here's a type of flow, and above it, it's sorting out other sediment particles and other types, and it's leaving these perfectly flat lines, and then here's the ash that's settled on top. Far as you could see up and down the valley, you would see these lines. And then as you go closer and closer and closer, right down to paper-thin little things that are called varves, V-A-R-V-E-S. And there's places on Earth where you can count 100,000 of these. And it's taught to the geologists, students. Each of these represent a season or a small event of summer to winter. And then there'll be another varve and another season or another year. And if there's 100,000 of them, it's 100,000 years. And it's taught as a fact. It's a fact of science. Well, these formed in a matter of hours, not over hundreds of thousands of years. So we visually have right in front of our face exactly how these things actually would have formed. So we got a little tiny river at the bottom of a great big valley. That little river didn't form that valley. The valley was formed by the mud flow, like a big plug of mud that just shoved its way through, shoved all the sediment ahead of it, and it left a new drainage pattern at the bottom of the valley. Little river at the bottom of a big valley with lots of erosion, like that. And it's 600 feet deep. It's a 1/10 scale model of the Grand Canyon, where at the end of the flood, the continents are being buoyed up by continental movement, not real slow like today, but rapidly. India is slamming up into Asia, shoving up the Himalayas near the end of the flood. You have fossil seashells at the top of Mount Everest. Those rock layers formed underwater. And by the way, the world's explanation doesn't work. If you have two continents coming together at today's speed, it's like these are two continental plates. And next year they're 1/4 of an inch closer. And a whole year later they're 1/4 of an inch closer. And then they touch. Are they going to shove themselves way up high in the air? They're either going to reverse or they're going to stop. Now, if you have two trains coming together at 30 or 40 miles an hour and those trains hit, you know what happens? It just heaves up a big rubble pile. That's what the mountains are. They form rapidly. They didn't form slowly the way we think things are happening today. Other lessons. That lake where half of the sediment was flushed into, it shoved all that water up out of the lake. About a 300-foot tall tidal wave slammed in all these surrounding hills. It's like a big bowl. It ripped every tree, every bit of soil. It eroded ruts down into solid basalt, erosional ruts, and it flushed the whole forest back down into the lake. Like a big toilet bowl. Wham! And it flushes back and forth. And now you have 1 million trees floating on Spirit Lake that used to be growing almost instantaneously. Now those trees are bumping back and forth into each other as they're being blown around by the wind and weather. Why does that matter? Well, again, how is the world trained to think? They leave out the second most significant event of all human history. So they have to explain things without it. Coal is one of those things that just doesn't fit what we're being told by the world around us. You go into any natural history museum or even dinosaur books, because we find dinosaur bones in the same general rock layers as coal seams. And they show dinosaurs just roaming around in swamps. Why? Because the world's covered with coal seams in a certain area of layer. This would have been a certain time during the flood where a lot of these things were being buried, and that's why it's in that layer. Well, when you drain a swamp, and this is a picture of a man below a drained swamp, the black stuff is peat. It's dead, decayed matter. The stuff below it is shale. That's just rock or pieces of limestone and other minerals that have turned into a rock layer. You find all sorts of roots going down and kind of mixing up, and you got worms and all sorts of stuff mixing up the dead trees as they've died in the swamp. Now, when a tree dies in a forest, it doesn't turn into coal, it turns back into soil, because microorganisms and fungus and stuff, they just eat it up, leaving the carbon matter that turns back into soil. But in a swamp, it's somewhat acidic, there's not as much decay, so the stuff will sit there without decaying indefinitely. And all it takes to form coal is to take undecayed vegetation and compress it under lots of pressure, and that in itself will increase the temperature. High temperature, lots of pressure, clay acts as a catalyst, and you can start to form coal in a matter of weeks in a laboratory. Doesn't take millions of years. But the thing is, coal, when you dig it up, falls apart in sheets, like a bunch of sheets of paper that have all just been compressed. And when you dig it, it just flakes apart like a bunch of things that have been compacted and compressed. But when we drain a swamp, it's all blended up like you put a blender in a bunch of mashed potatoes. So the characteristics of swamps don't match the characteristics of coal. The world ignores that because it's the only explanation they have. Well, Steve Austin, he's a Christian, believed in the worldwide flood, got his PhD in geology, University of Pennsylvania, big coal producing area. He proposed, and by the way, there's a high likelihood if you were to go into any geology class and say, I believe there's been a literal worldwide flood, and stick to your guns and start to show the evidence, you would be flunked. You wouldn't be allowed to get a PhD. You have to defend your beliefs in your thesis and your original research work in front of a board of experts. They can turn down your PhD and they don't even have to tell you why. And it's happened many, many times, documented by Jerry Bergman and others. But anyway, he proposed a different idea that maybe there was a big floating mat of vegetation and that stuff would fall off of this mat, just organic matter, and collect underneath, and it would pack down in layers, and then if you had a bunch of sediment that just got shoved over on top of it, you could form a coal seam that had a layered appearance. And he did all sorts of research, published his PhD thesis, defended it before the experts, and they said, well, you did really good work, and your model fits really well what coal looks like. The only problem, they said, was that coal is so widespread around the earth. This is one layer of rock that contains lots of coal, brown coal and black coal, and it covers an entire continent. They said, for your model to be right, the whole world would have had to have been covered by water at one time. And we all know that couldn't have happened. See, they're not driven by that. There's a narrative. Have we ever seen a narrative and everybody just talks about the narrative and whatever fits it isn't talked about recently? Yeah, we've seen that happen. Well, that's what's happened in science for the last 100 years. The narrative is slow, gradual processes, lots of time, explain everything. And that's all that's shown. The last example of the things that can be learned from this event, there were a bunch of trees that are just bobbing upside down, right side up in the lake. Now here's what's going on. At the bottom of the lake, things eventually get waterlogged and they'll start to drop because they become heavier than water. They decay away, and what's left drops and it gets buried by all the other dust and dirt and things that are coming into the lake and building up on the bottom. Some of them get buried this way, but some of them are waterlogged at one end more, so they sink down and then stuff just builds up around them. And that's what they were seeing at the bottom of the lake. This is sonar tracking, where they estimate 10,000 trees ripped off of the surrounding cliffs are now standing right side up at the bottom of the lake. And they're at different levels. Some of them end here at this level, some of them go further down to that level, and this is the sediment that has them buried. That reminded Steve Austin, as he was studying this whole thing, of a place called Specimen Ridge in Yellowstone National Park. Now this was a sign that was in the park for probably decades, where it talks about how did all these petrified trees get on this ridge. And there on that park sign, you see this little spot, and I'm going to enlarge it. The story goes, and it's the same story that's in all the geology books for all the geology students worldwide that are studying to get a degree in geology, as the evidence that the earth has to be much older than the Bible would tell us. It's been used to ridicule the biblical belief and time frame for 100 years. You see, down at the bottom of this layer of rock, there's a bunch of snapped off trees. And then above them, there's another layer of a slightly different type of sediment with snapped off trees. And then maybe you're the original kind of sediment with snapped off trees, and then some rock agglomerates and snapped off trees. There's 32 subsequent layers. And it says this represents at least 100,000 years of Earth history, because in this active geological area, there was a forest, and an explosion happened, and the trees got snapped off, And they're so big in diameter that it must have taken anywhere from 200 to 500 years or more for mature forest to grow. And probably more than that because it took a long time for them to get started again. So if you have 32 forests times 500 years, you have like 150,000 years of Earth history. And it's proof that that much time has passed. Now, nobody had a better explanation until Mount St. Helens, and he noticed what was happening at the bottom of that lake. Now, I've been out there, and I've walked up to the top of Specimen Ridge, and I've took this picture. I mean, here's a tree at this level, and here's a tree further up at that level, and on up here, there's another tree up here at this level, and you see these trees, solid rock at different levels. And here's looking back down the mountain, same thing. You see them kind of as you're looking down toward the valley. Well, after it was proposed that, wow, maybe this was just a flood event that buried all of them at the same time, they started to look closer, and they realized none of them had roots that extended on down into the level, into the soil. They were all just broken off root bundles. And they started to look at tree rings, and they could see that the tree rings were similar in different forests that supposedly grew 200 or 500 years apart, yet they had the same pattern of tree rings. So they took the sign down. They realized they must have all been from the same flood event. But now if you look at that, over here at the other side of the valley are sediment layers, and here up the top of this hill are sediment layers, and these are the same sediment layers as those. That means all of this sediment between these two hills has all been flushed and washed away. And these hills must have been covered by 1,000 foot of water. Now the best picture I've ever heard of the flood when it was happening, and there's many just really good models and theories and ideas about what was going on during Noah's flood, and it was a whole year event. It wasn't just 40 days and 40 nights of rain and it's gone. It wasn't just, oh, the water kind of rose up and then like came back down again. It was total world devastation. First of all, when you have water moving at 20 miles an hour instead of 10 miles an hour, it's 10 times more destructive. 30 miles an hour, it's 100 times more destructive. 40 miles an hour, it's 1,000 times more destructive. You fill it with sediment, it's another order of magnitude or more. It's like 10,000 or 100,000 times more destructive. We see boulders moved 500 miles across their source out west, and you can calculate how deep and how fast water had to have been moving across the continent to do those sort of things. And we're talking about water moving probably 50, 60 miles an hour across entire continents 1,000 feet deep filled with rubble. It would have scoured continents smooth. And it's carrying all this stuff it's picked up. And as it slows down, that stuff gets sorted and dropped out into new sediment layers. And depending on all sorts of complex interactions, where it's picked up animals and bodies, it's going to get moved to different layers and different sediment areas. So where did it all go? Well, if you look at the Earth, it's been cracked open from the North Pole all the way down through the middle of the Atlantic Ocean to Argentina and back up through Venezuela and California all the way to Alaska. The Earth has cracked open. It's called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And enormous amounts of lava is pouring out, and it's like 10,000 degrees. So it is vaporizing trillions of gallons of ocean water. Now that's carrying with it, as it turns into superheated steam, enormous amounts of liquid water, miles up into the atmosphere. So as all that lava is pouring out, and maybe as a mechanism to start shoving continents apart, it's coming back down as rain. Day after day, week after week, month after month, or a month, 40 days and 40 nights of continuous buckets and buckets of rain, pulverizing this planet, shoving the water up out of the ocean basins and across continents. Now there's various good, valid, technical people debating whether it was a hydroplate, lots of water into the continents were allowing to move, or it was actually continental drift kind of movement in fast forward. But it doesn't matter what the exact mechanism was. There's the evidence is there by studying the rock layers that this is a real event. Here's the issue. If you leave it out, you're guaranteed to misinterpret the past. you're guaranteed to misinterpret the fossil record. You're guaranteed to misinterpret the age of the formation of all those rocks. And God is making the truth absolutely obvious. This is one example. By the way, I've got a friend down in Indianapolis that makes these, and he said, if I get 10 or more at a time, I can get them for like $80 or $90 each. And I'm thinking about selling these. It's a cast of what is obviously a stegosaurus that's been found carved into a Cambodian temple that's about 1,000 years old. Now, any 3-year-old, when they look at this and ask them what it is, most of them are going to know it's a stegosaurus even at 3, 4, 5 years old. You ask a PhD professor, and he'll say, oh, it must be a rhinoceros, because it's an animal that was seen by these people that carved the temple. Everything else, there's antelopes, there's snakes, there's birds. Every other animal carved is a real animal. And along with it is what is obviously a stegosaurus. They saw these creatures. So they had to have been taken with Noah on the ark. The bones are in the ground because of the dinosaurs that died during the flood. But this is the kind of evidence, and it's just one of dozens and dozens of examples of cultures that after the flood knew about dinosaurs. And I forgot to bring it, but I recently was given an exact replica of a dinosaur skull that looks exactly like the depiction of a dragon. It's got these huge horns and all these big warts sticking out and a long snout. It looks just like drawings of a dragon from China and Europe and so on, but it's a real skull. The word dragon was used to mean dinosaur before the word dinosaur was ever invented. And you find it throughout human history. So that's the kind of stuff to show people. I mean, that's just a stark, great conversation starter for how do these things fit into a biblical history, which means the history they're hearing is wrong. Now, I want to wrap up with the most significant event in all human history. And by the way, this is the end of the flood slide. God warned us and predicted us that we would be in exactly where we're at as a humankind sometime in the future. And I'm going to come in a moment back to this whole time issue. This is God telling us what's going to happen because He knows everything that will ever happen before it happened. He knew we were going to sin before He made us, but He still made us. Okay? Because time is part of the box we call creation. I mean, if you look at creation, let me just grab a prop. If you look at the entire universe as this box, okay? Everything in it is like the planets and the stars and the matter and the energy and all life and organisms and all people. It's all in the box. Time is part of the box. And it's been tested in a dozen different ways ever since Einstein proposed general and special relativity, that time can move at different rates depending on the mass surrounding it and in its location and the acceleration speed at which someone's moving through space. Time itself will change. So time is part of the box. It's really a well-established scientific principle. God is not part of the box. So God is outside of time. Now, if you take nothing else out of this lecture, I hope you really take what this scientific understanding of God's nature. To be outside of time, the best way I can visualize it is that God lives in the past, present, and future simultaneously. He's there. He can be in all three at the same time because He's not part of the box. He's like looking down at it. He's looking at the past, present, and future all at the same time. He can be in all three places. And because He's not limited by time, you know, if you are just having a really tough time or you're just wanting to praise Him and you're just in real truth and spirit, just praying and fellowshipping with God, you realize the creator of the entire universe can focus 100% of His attention totally on you. Think about that. And then he has just as much time to spend with every other of one of the 8 billion people here on the planet. And He hasn't lost any of His time. That's giving you a picture of His nature when you really understand time's part of the universe and He's not. And it's why the Bible is filled with prophecies, already been fulfilled, not yet been fulfilled, in the process of being fulfilled, in advance, in specific, intricate detail. And this is one of them. In the last days, those periods of earth history right before God is going to wrap things up. And since for him, a day might as well be 1,000 years, and 1,000 years might be a day. It doesn't define a day, it defines his very nature. You know, the last days may be a few days, they may be 100 years. We don't know. But we should be aware of the seasons and the times, even if we don't know the exact day something's going to happen. But a sign that we're near is that there will be a widespread denial by scoffers who choose to ignore and forget the mighty, most significant events God has ever done. And two of those are that the earth was formed out of water and by water. That's a direct reference to creation. The Spirit of the Lord hovered over the waters of the deep. And that the world that then was deluged and destroyed, the worldwide flood. When we reach a point in world history where the vast majority totally deny and ignore that there's ever been a creation and there's ever been a flood, we're going to be living in what God knew would come, or he calls the last days. Guess what, people? That's where we are, and it's only been that way for the last couple hundred years at most. And it's getting worse by the day as we become an increasing minority in the cultures around us. Last, and it's again the time nature of God that makes this so significant. And you're going to see this verse repeated on every slide as I walk our way through why this matters so much. Our Creator died for us. That is so huge. He became a human being. And then he took that penalty of sin upon himself. And he knew he was going to do it before he ever made the first one of us. And he knew he had to give us the freedom to obey or not obey, the freedom to love or not love, the freedom to choose him or reject him. Otherwise, we're just robots like any other animal, driven only by instincts, or primarily. But it wasn't when we'd chosen to follow him with everything in us. It wasn't when we'd cleaned up our act, while we were still sinners, while we didn't deserve it, when there was nothing we did that could ever please him, because no one is righteous, not even one. When our best efforts at being holy and righteous before God, and in the original language, are like a dirty minstrel cloth. That's what we are compared when we try to work our way into God's right presence. That's what he died for us. So, and I'm going to throw out a scripture for each of these and how significant it is, and then we're going to be wrapping up. On the cross, Jesus literally became sin for every human being of all time. Everyone who ever lived in the past, everybody that was alive when he died, everybody now 2,000 years later. Now that sounds absurd to the world around us, okay? What's a 2,000-year-old Jew on a cross have to do with me? We're even trained that sin is even irrelevant, okay? But we all know it. Deep down we know it, because when it happens to us, we know how unfair it is. Because Jesus was God, and he said it over and over and over again, about a dozen or more times. He said, I am God. Before Abraham was, I am. In other ways, God is outside of time. So literally, scientifically, not just in some moral philosophical concept, the God of the universe, who was Jesus here on earth, when he died, he was dying for you. If you choose to accept what he did for you. If you just ignore it or treat it flippantly or deny it, it does no good. He literally 2,000 years ago had us in mind as he was dying there on the cross. Because he's unlimited in the amount of time. He knows every hair on every human being's head. He knows the name of every star in heaven. And you could do that if time is unlimited for you. You're starting to get a feel for the characteristics of God and how it's tied into time itself. makes it so much more real and significant when we don't leave science out of understanding what God tells us in his word. And the scripture to support that he died for every one of us, for he has made him to be sin for us, he who knew no sin, so that we might be made righteous in God, of God in him. We get the righteousness of Christ who knew no sin. And we can't make it happen. We just have to accept it. We have to yield. See, all of the good things we do aren't to help us with our salvation or make God love us more. They're all in response, in gratitude to what he's already done for us. It's the only thing that will ever work. This is a science creation session, but this is reality. And this is why it even matters. That's why I wanted to bring it with a different kind of talk tonight. This is the second enormously significant reason for this significant event. Accepting what he did, having him put his righteousness on us, it frees us from the curse of eternal death. You understand why the Philippines shut down their entire public school system and did not allow one student to step into any school for 2 solid years? Because they'd been scared about death. And those students weren't even at risk of dying. But death is such a powerful tool to scare people that they'll give up almost unlimited freedom. But we don't have to be afraid of death. It frees us from that fear. O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? Doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. And there isn't missing of those who die that we've loved. But if we know that this life isn't all there is, if we know at the moment of death, we're simply stepping through a door into a reality that's even more real than the one we just stepped out of. And we know that we know that we know that's true. Boy, the sting is orders and orders of magnitude less. And that's what God has done for us in this way. Third really significant thing about our very Creator dying for us, he enables us to walk in fellowship with him again. Read the Gospels. Jesus called those who were not accepting who he was and what he'd done as the enemies of God. That's all it takes to be an enemy of God. What did Adam do? As soon as he sinned, he tried to hide from God. And that's all every human being's tried to do ever since. Either make God in our image or try to pretend we could do enough works to please God or distort God, or in the modern age, pretend God doesn't even exist and everything can be explained without him, and that the mighty acts of God have never happened. The supporting verse again, as many as receive him, to them he gives the power to become the sons of God. Not to everybody, just those who receive him, and to those who believe on his name. See, that's the criteria. Not what we do, not our works, not our prayers, not our good acts. It's what we do with what he's done for us. The next huge thing, we are told over and over again, we are captive to sin. Because we're related to Adam and everybody knows us, we will and do sin. And God's standard is absolute perfection. Anything else he knows will just get worse and worse and worse and deteriorate. So we are now made free from sin, becoming servants to God instead of servants to the sin. And our fruit is that we now have the ability for holiness and everlasting life. We didn't even have that ability before. And then the last one, he gives us an ultimate purpose in life. And if this life is all there is but just to go through life and earn some money and raise some kids and do some good things, it really is pretty empty. It's going to fall empty. In the end, it is. God says, I am crucified with Christ. We need to crucify our sinful self, and then we will live. But it's not I, but Christ who lives in me. The life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved and gave himself for me. And I just pulled out, and there's a whole bunch of these. I pulled out a few other ones in the Bible that I love. So what brings our fulfillment? It is when, this is Psalm 145, verse 4, when one generation should praise thy works to another, declare thy mighty acts. When we're declaring God's mighty acts, that brings purpose and meaning to our life. The end of Ecclesiastes said, let's hear the conclusion of the whole matter. When Solomon had tried everything, he'd tried sex, he'd tried money, he tried knowledge, he tried entertainment, he tried everything to bring meaning and fulfillment in life. Love Ecclesiastes, and it all fell short. And then the conclusion of the matter is, fear God, keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of man. So we will be saved? No, because that's what will bring meaning. And by the way, that ancient Hebrew word fear, is a lot of it's tied up in total, absolute awe, unfathomable awe of who God is and what he's done, to have died for us amongst all the other things. And Jesus said, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and then all things, the contentment of life, the meaning of life, the purpose of life, all things will be added unto you. So I just want to end right there, that this isn't just about creation. This is about connecting God himself, his very characteristics, to the most significant events that really happen, and then sharing them, the mighty acts, with the people around us. And it's my hope that some of these tools that connect people to the reality that they have a creator leads to the conversations that this creator is also your Savior. And I hope that helps as a kind of an overview for why all this matters. Thank you so much.
I've seen a lot of your work on Genesis Science Network presentation.
Sure. What are the Rocks Cry Out presentations? Well, the Rocks Cry Out project with the flash drives where you can get all 20 of these, it's a 4-year project. And what I did, I prayed about it for about 5 years. How do I take 30 years of teaching and turning it into a curriculum that people are going to enjoy watching? Not just someone standing in front of a church with a bunch of slides. And God brought into my life a young man who graduated from Lawrence Tech University in Michigan with a videography degree. And he wanted to do it all. He wanted to do animation, he wanted to do filming, he wanted to do editing, he wanted to do music, he wanted to do all of it. And he didn't specialize and he didn't have a job lined up. So I said, would you be willing to work with me? So we would take a trip out to California, the two of us, and we'd either camp or stay in cheap hotels. And we'd go to Bryce and Zion in the Grand Canyon over about a week-long period and film. So it would be 7 days. It would take him 2 months to do each 45-minute episode because he was doing it all. You ever see a movie, it's got all these people listed. But he'd do the editing. Typically, since I'm working from 30 years of doing teaching, I would, and they're not scripted. I never wrote a script and I don't have a teleprompter. I would just teach like I'm talking to you guys, like friends that I'm trying to share truth with. And we could usually do it in one take with a few little things added in. But then the editing and the adding and the pictures. Let me show you a little clip from one of them. This is lesson number 6 on the age of creation. I mean, one of them is on the miracle of life. A couple of them are on the brilliance of ancient mankind and cultures. Some of them.
My wife and I just watched that one last night.
The age of the earth? Yeah, well, here's the teaser to give you a feel for the quality of these things.
To pretend that God has always had death and disease and bloodshed and extinctions in his creation is a very distortion of what God's word says. I often hear people say, well, it really doesn't matter when God created, as long as I acknowledge that God is creator. God tells us that creation is not just good, but very good. There is method after method after method after method of determining how old are things, and time after time, they show a recent creation. the central emphasis of
This was filmed in the Perot Science Museum in Dallas, Texas.
4.5 billion.
It was historic was bacteria.
That is the foundation
Turned into people as a fact.
philosophy of evolution and naturalism. We've got to go around an established system of training people to think in only one possible way. Millions and billions of years, evolution is a fact, and show them the beauty and reality of the evidence that supports a true biblical creation model of why we exist.
So I just want to show you kind of what they look like. So yeah, they took about 2 months each, and we worked on them for 3 to 4 years. I just filmed number 19, by the way. Whoever's not on my newsletter list, make sure you sign up. It's free. I talk about these. I'm thinking about bringing these out, by the way, in Blu-ray quality. Right now, they're just in DVD quality. But instead of a 16 gigabyte stick, I'll have to be putting one on a 64 gigabyte stick. But when that happens, you'll see it in the newsletter. So make sure you sign up. So thanks for giving me a chance to talk about that. Other questions? Yes.
The question was concerned with two parts.
Sure.
One, are you a pastor? And the second one, you said you've been doing it for 30 years. Was that after you switched over from, you said you were an engineer?
Yeah. Yeah, okay, the question was about my history. When did I start doing this? What's my theological background? My theological background is that once I became a Christian, I just studied God's Word and everything that had to do with it. Everything from Francis Schaeffer to Chuck Colson to Henry Morris and all of these kind of things, C.S. Lewis. I never went back to get any sort of theological degree. I also never looked back to go get a PhD. I have a bachelor in science and chemical engineering. Worked for 27, almost 28 years as a chemical engineer, research leader, developed 18 patents. I love science. I love seeing how creation works. And God's just used me to connect the two. Creation, how it works, and with the evidence that He has done exactly what He said, how He said, and when He said. And by the way, after He's done with creation, God looks at everything He's made and He said, it's not just good, it is very good. Well, if there have been 2 billion years of death and disease and bloodshed and extinction as the rock layers have slowly built up, and then He creates Adam and Eve only 6,000 years ago or so, and they're standing on 2 billion years of death and disease and bloodshed and cancers and issues. How can that be a very good creation? You see, you got to start going through the Bible with a black magic marker and marking stuff out in order to hang on to the time frame and what we're clearly told. And it's unnecessary because the assumptions and the problems with the dating methods and the ones that are ignored aren't there. Now, when did I start doing this? When I got out of college, because I love science, and because I came through the American education system, God was totally irrelevant to me. Everything I thought had been explained as if God doesn't even exist. Cosmic evolution and the Big Bang explained where all the matter and energy came from. Chemical evolution explained how life has come together. And we see the youth are permeated with the idea of aliens are just popping up everywhere, but all the movies they watch. Well, that means life just pops up everywhere by itself. Biological evolution, that one animal's turned into another, turned into another, turned into another, and eventually turned into people, is taught as a fact. Bacteria changed into all of us. And it's supported by supposedly geological evolution, what's in the rock layers. But you can only come to those conclusions if you leave out what God says about biology 10 times. In the very first book, He says, birds only make birds, reproduce after their own kind. Trees only make trees. Fish only make fish. Cattle only make cattle. Says those things 10 times. That's biology. Geology is the worldwide flood. That explains the rock layers and the fossils, but it wipes out the time frame. Well, a speaker came to our church after lots of people, and the Lord worked on me, and I almost died, and I started wondering what life's all about anyway. And I accepted Christ as my Savior. Within a month, a speaker comes to our church to talk about this ridiculous idea, in my mind, that humans were created, and an ape didn't turn into a human. Well, to me, that was a scientific fact. Now, I was a Christian, okay? If I had died the next day thinking that apes turned into humans, I would have still been in heaven. If I had been hit by a car and believed the Big Bang made all the time, space, and energy and had nothing to do with God necessarily, because science had proven it, I'd have still been in heaven. But I was totally wrong. We drag into our Christianity, when we accept what Christ has done, all sorts of wrong ideas and wrong beliefs and wrong behaviors, and God still accepts us. But then he expects us to look for truth. And he gave us his word so we can find truth. And shame on us as Christians if we just distort it in order to fit what we want to believe before we became Christians. So that's what I did. I think I just had this real desire for truth. And when this speaker came to talk about the worldwide flood and I saw what he had to present and all the evidence for it, I realized if that's right, then everything I've been taught in school about the age of things and biology and the slow transformation of creatures and apes turning into people, if the flood is right, then all that's wrong. And I didn't just immediately wow, okay, I accept it. I studied it for the next 6 months. And the more I studied, the more irritated I became because of all the stuff I had been left out. And I guess that's what I encourage all of you to do is put the truth in front of people, put things like this and little pebbles of truth and examples and soft dinosaur tissue and the fact fossils aren't even forming today and yet the rocks are full of fossils. Just put them in front of people in conversations and treat the flood as a real event of world history. Treat why death even exists as a real event of world history. And God will do the rest. But here's the rub. When we do that, we're going to be ignored. We're going to be ridiculed. On some level, we're going to be persecuted. But the thing God loves above all else, in my opinion, is faith and obedience. And then he'll do amazing things with it. So that's my encouragement and my story. Yes. I'll mention it. 3 years ago, I was asked to do an Alaska cruise, and I always thought going on a cruise was about equivalent to being a cow being herded into a gate at a stockyard. But I was asked to be the speaker where every night I do a little creation talk, I think 6 of them over the course of 7 days. And it was so much fun. I mean, it was just a phenomenal week. And they feed you like you wouldn't believe on these trips. So anyway, there's another one coming up. It's being run by a Baptist church up in Chicago area called Quinton Road Baptist Church. They do a phenomenal conference every summer called the Grace Conference, if you ever want to go to a great Christian conference. But this tour is in July, and if you're interested, love to have you along. It's not too late to sign up. And again, with the newsletters, you'll see one of these little brochures about the Alaska cruise. And I don't even get paid for this, but they part of what they do is cover my costs, so I get to eat for free. So, and I think that's a good deal. But you don't. You'll have to pay for the cruise. So thank you for mentioning that. Okay, anything else? Way in the back.
So basically you said, I have some things that I want to share with you. I think one question is that you said that ancient history is just, it's just kind of, speculative.
Okay, let me just make sure I got you clear. You're saying my precept is that the current culture's understanding of ancient history is just based on ideas. It's not necessarily right.
True, it's just kind of based. I think history is just kind of based off of documents and kind of what we have gathered.
Sure.
And all that type of stuff. Trying to piece together what happened, back then.
I would say that's absolutely true. Are you going somewhere with this question, or are there a comment on what you just said?
I was just kind of, asking what you meant by that.
Well, that's exactly what I mean by that. No scientist, no archaeologist has a time machine. None of them, okay? So the human mind works. In many of my lectures, especially these rocks crowd, I end with about a 5-minute segment showing the human mind forms a framework of what it believes to be truth or reality. Even science is supposed to work this way. Science is supposed to have an idea of what they think to be the truth about something. It's called a hypothesis or a theory, and ultimately, if all the evidence supports it, everything you've ever tested supports it, it becomes a law of science, and there's never been an exception. But the goal of science, since we can never know everything, is to try to find something that will disprove that what you believe is true. Because you can never get enough information to know for sure it's true. You understand what I'm saying? Same is true with the past. You can never know for sure by observing and finding documents and doing radiometric dating and looking at ancient cultures for sure knowing what has happened. It always involves a starting assumption. Now, let me just talk for a moment. Archaeologists have been trained for hundreds of years that the history of our planet involves apes turning into human beings. So there should be a pattern of really rudimentary use of tools and buildings and languages leading to more and more advanced cultures. And that everything should fit into a Stone Age, followed by a Bronze Age, followed by an Iron Age, followed by a Modern Age. And when they find stuff, they stick it into that framework. So that's that framework of what they believe is reality. So when you've been taught that, and you see a bunch of stuff fits, you just assume it's true. The human mind actually starts to not even be capable of seeing things that don't fit. Well, what I'm saying is there's a whole bunch of evidence that doesn't fit the idea of the Big Bang. Lots of it contradicts the Big Bang. But instead of throwing out that idea, it's just assumed to be true, and those things are ignored and just tossed away. The same thing with the huge gaps between all sorts of animal groups, body structures and types. There are enormous gaps that no way a little small step change at a time could change one animal structure into a totally different one. Information never makes itself. It just deteriorates when exposed to random processes. And yet it's assumed that the DNA code just got more and more and more complex, and whatever doesn't fit it is ignored. The same with archaeology. Whatever doesn't fit, Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, Modern Age, is just ignored. But there's all sorts of evidence that that's not true. And the other possibility is that after the flood, some cultures had all sorts of knowledge from before the flood and very rapidly developed enormously complex civilizations, such as the Egyptians and the Peruvians and the Chinese. They rapidly developed very high technology. Meanwhile, an ice age is happening, and there are people pushed to the fringes of human culture that are eking out of existence, living in caves and trying to just survive with almost no knowledge or tools. So you have Stone Age people living exactly the same time as highly advanced civilizations. And the pyramids are stunningly built and advanced and precise. And we still can't even explain how they did it. So see, those sort of things fit a biblical viewpoint. Now, have I proved the Bible's right? Absolutely not. Belief in the Bible is belief in faith, but I would put the evidence that supports a biblical framework up against the evidence that supports a secular framework any day of the week, and the biblical evidence will win. It's just we choose to ignore it as a culture. I hope that helps. Go ahead.
Have you read any of the DNA ones now that they're exploring that?
The what?
The DNA evidence of, the generations and stuff, and Noah. And so at Noah's time, there were his 3 sons, and they're now every male.
The genetics has become the strongest scientific evidence for the support of a biblical time frame. And what you're referring to, by looking at genetic markers that appear and are followed all the way down through generations and when they first appeared, they've pretty conclusively been able to show that all human beings came from 3 original males. Not like 1 original male or 5 or 12, but 3. They can all so far be tracked back to 3. And the only time that would have happened were the 3 sons of Noah. And that's who we're told every human being came from. It was a bottleneck that happened, and then we all spread out from that. And there's other evidence, too, from genetics.
God gave us that at this time because we are.
Well, I think before things wrap up, God is willing that none would perish. Now, he will allow us to perish because he won't force us to believe, trust, or love, or obey. But he is making the truth abundantly clear in our lifetimes. And I'm thinking of things like soft dinosaur tissue. I'm thinking of things like all the examples of how people knew and saw dinosaur-type creatures, which doesn't fit a secular viewpoint. I'm thinking of things from genetics. I'm thinking of things like we see every genome of every creature deteriorating with every generation, and it's not getting better. And there's lots of other examples that fall into that. Okay. Should we wrap it up? It is okay.